As we all know, air is one of drag racing's most studied things. On a day-to-day basis, its temperature, atmospheric weight, and direction of travel are studied relentlessly, not just by professional racers, but by anyone who is making a run, from a local bracket racer to a top fuel crew chief. Air may affect the power level of a drag racer's engine, but ultimately air itself is not the machine's power source. Usually. Back in 1962 and 1963, two cars were built powered by air. Not by internal combustion engines that used it to oxidize fuel, but the air itself, in a highly pressurized form, actually provided the motive force for two of the sport's most incredibly weird cars. And no, they weren't thrust cars. These were wheel-driven machines motivated by air. Both made headlines, one for the right reasons, and one for reasons that border on the nightmarish. But I digress. The first thing I've got to mention to anybody who thinks we're about to talk about Mickey Thompson or Art Malone, the answer is no. Both Mickey Thompson's and Malone's compressed air drag racing machines used air in the place of a traditional supercharger to boost an internal combustion engine. In Thompson's case, force-feeding a Boss 429 powered funny car with several small bottles, and in Malone's, a sideways-mounted Hemi at the rear of his chassis. The entire front of the car was designed to hold a single massive air bottle. Both of those cars deserve their own video, and maybe there will be one, but they have zero in common with the two cars we're about to explore here, and you'll see why very shortly. Our story begins in earnest in May of 1961. By this time, the famed Speed Sport team of Tucson, Arizona, led by Red Greth, Lyle Fisher, Joe Bush, and Don Maynard, had become nationally known. Their famed old noisy roadster with its rear-mounted Hemi and 8 exhaust pipes was capable of running with and beating the finest dragsters in the land. This was one of the first ever paid drag racing teams as well. They were paid to travel to different parts of the country in the late 1950s, and while they were not getting rich, they were still living the dream. It was at a race in Arizona, at Beeline Dragway in 1961, that the team was approached by 3 engineers from the AiResearch wing of the Garrett Corporation. Don Hettinger, Cal Sorensen, and John Brown had an idea. They wanted to find drag racers who would equip a car with the company's pneumatic jet engine turbine starters to use as a power plant. Now, why they wanted to do this still remains a slight mystery. An investigation into the 3 guys involved reveals no drag racing history, but if we look around, you can see that slowly but surely, drag racers around the country were beginning to use the Garrett turbocharger in their drag racing applications, so perhaps that planted a seed with a far more wild experiment. When the guys began to talk to Red Greth and Company, they explained that a single one of their air turbine jet starters produced as much torque as their whole existing nitro Hemi engine did, and these things weighed less than 50 pounds. In theory, a car could employ multiple examples simultaneously and produce more power than anything the sport had seen to that point in 1961. Now, I'm of the opinion that their indecision on the project was broken on the spot when it was revealed that this wouldn't be some clandestine exercise, but rather something that AiResearch would be footing the bill for most of, employing their engineers on, and helping to promote as well. If those guys didn't say yes immediately on the spot, it was shortly thereafter. Now, it didn't take long for what would be known as the Speed Sport 4 to come together, but before we go any further with that story, we have to talk about the units that would be turning air into tire smoke and hopefully elapsed times that could challenge what the best in the sport were producing. So how the heck can a jet engine air starter power a dragster? Well, the same way it starts a big jet engine, actually. On a commercial aircraft, even back in the day, there's a thing called an APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit. Now, this auxiliary power unit is a little turbine engine in and unto itself that is typically spun up with an electric motor. As it spins up, it produces electricity for the aircraft's various systems, and it also produces pressurized air that is sent to the starters on the turbine engines under the wings. This pressurized air is shot across an impeller, which spins a bunch of gears that are connected to an output shaft that is connected to the engine. When the turbine reaches such a speed that combustion can be self-sustained, the little starter disengages and is simply along for the ride. If you've ever sat and listened to an airplane engine spin up, you're listening to one of these bad boys do its job. And as you can imagine, it takes big torque to accelerate the engine up to thousands and thousands of RPM in order to get that self-sustaining combustion. In the case of our heroes here, The turbines were rated at 750 foot-pounds of torque each in stock fashion, and they weighed 35 pounds apiece. On paper, this car was going to be something the likes of which the sport had never imagined possible. Now, the chassis was the handiwork of the Speed Sport guys. It was a 115-inch wheelbase unit with the driver situated midships and the true working end of the car in the aft. The chassis itself wasn't revolutionary. It was about the same type of the era, meaning a typical tapered ladder structure, the driver sitting behind the front axle, which was from a 1937 Willys and used a transverse spring. A guy named Red Higgins machined the hubs and built the lightweight front wheels. Now, if the whole thing kind of looks overdone with respect to its massive diameter lower frame rails, there's an explanation coming for that in a minute. As you'll see in different images, the car was run early with no body, and then the legendary IndyCar builder and fabricator Eddie Kuzma was commissioned to swap the whole thing in the handsome hand-formed body you'll see, and the equally amazing Dean Jeffries was tapped to paint it. Now, these 2 points alone speak to the corporate involvement and budget thrown at this car by AiResearch and its Phoenix office. These guys would not have sprung for that level of luxury to get this car just simply looking good. So, now to the good stuff and the stuff that caused most consternation between the team and the engineers, which was, of course, the powertrain. The only real friction in the whole build came when things got, quote, worked on paper for Red Greth. Things were disputed and outright refused by Greth and his team because the engineers didn't understand what would happen with the actual physical car versus their theories. The experience of the team in the sport had taught them a lot, and just because there were theoretical explorations on graph paper, they knew that a lot of them wouldn't translate into a successful effort. Now, in the end, everybody worked well together to make a finished product. That was way too heavy. Now, the problem was the air, and not just the air itself, but how to carry it, and certainly to carry it at high enough pressure and volume to make this all work. The first version of the car had 2 massive oblong tanks that weighed 450 pounds apiece. Combined with the rest of the car, the thing was over 2,200 pounds. More on that in a second. Now, behind the tanks was this round case that was described as a hat box, but in reality it was the transmission. The 3 starters were mounted to the back of it in a triangular shape, and their output shafts were each splined into a shaft carried by a bearing at both ends. And there was 1 sprocket in the center. The 3 turbine output shafts all powered 1 central shaft that was tied into a reduction gear set and then into an old Ford truck rear axle that powered the car. Now, this is where the excess weight we talked about comes into play, because the thing was destroying axles like matchsticks, even on the hard tires of 1962, and that was when it was simply coming off the starting line. Now, there were other issues that needed solving as well. There had to be a better, lighter solution for tanks, of course, but the car was barely traveling a couple hundred feet when it could before petering out, and it was creating a miniature snowstorm behind itself, and I'm not kidding about that part. See, the air when it was whooshing out of the tanks and rocketing through the turbines was well below freezing. When that air was hitting the atmospheric air behind the car, it was freezing the moisture in it and causing what is repeatedly described in multiple reports as a little snowstorm in its wake. It wasn't enough to accumulate or even fully materialize, but it was an interesting side note for a car that seemed to be just choking and choking publicly. Oh, and it should be mentioned that everyone that was expecting at least a little thrust from the discharge of the turbines, they were wrong. They put nozzles on the car because they thought there would be something to be done there, but there was none to speak of. The electronics on the car were fairly complicated as well. There were many different metering circuits and switches required to make this whole thing work, to keep the turbines from overspeeding, and from making the whole thing into a giant compressed air bomb, and those were giving everybody fits each and every run, along with all the other issues. Before we get to the problem solving, though, we have to go into a bit of a review. Remember, huge tanks of compressed air, released when the driver stepped on the throttle, would hit a pressure regulator and instantly spin the turbines to what would then spin their shafts, which was tied to an axle, which would power the car. The Speed Sport 4 would leave on 2 turbines, and then the third, in a perfect world, would come on in a second or so into the run. Okay, back to the problem solving. Starting from the top, AiResearch ponied up Lord knows how much to buy 4 spherical tanks from Lockheed that were used in their Electra airplane. The total weight of these 4 tanks, only 200 pounds versus the massive weight of the old ones. Now that solved the issue and kept the necessary volume of air in play. The next solution was a biggie. a combustor was added ahead of the turbines. Now, what, pray tell, is a combustor? It was the trick to making this thing truly work. Remember how we talked about the air being so cold it was freezing the moisture out of the atmosphere? Well, cold air is really dense and thereby not as efficient for the job the guys were wanting it to do here. That's where the combustor comes in. Plumbed behind the tank and before the turbine entry point, the combustor had a champion spark plug firing 25 times a second and a constant stream of flammable liquid heading into it. Kerosene, gasoline, perfume, it didn't matter. It took air that was sub-zero and heated it to 1,300 degrees instantly, causing it to expand on a massive scale and thereby kind of supercharging the operation of the turbines. All of a sudden, they had a car that could smoke a pair of 10-inch M&H slicks a full quarter mile when it went straight, and something that went in the low nines before the public ever knew it existed. The performance was there, the innovation was there, and Redgreth knew there was one more problem, and it was unsolvable. The thing made no noise. It sounded like a leaking air hose on steroids. Perhaps keeping this concern to himself, he moved ahead and didn't say anything. The boys were officially ready for prime time in the late spring of 1962. After almost a year of stumbles, frustrations, and failures, they were going to succeed. And the world was about to get a show, and boy did they ever. Okay, maybe not the first time though. On May 21st, 1962, the Speed Sport boys brought their trusty Speed Sport 3 rear-engine roadster and their new wacky air car to the Davis Mountain Drag Strip in Tucson. They won in the roadster. The air car was plagued with pressure issues and electrical gremlins, which made it much ado about nothing. But on June 17th, the car showed up and showed out, turning the quickest elapsed time in the history of the Davis Mountain Drag Strip with an 875 at 161 miles an hour. And this was not going to be a local secret. AiResearch had done a national tour. They booked the car from coast to coast, including the honor of being featured as an exhibition attraction at the NHRA Nationals in Indy. A 9,000-mile odyssey of races, car shows, exhibitions, and more was planned, and they were off. Less than a month after the Tucson runs, they were in Cordova, Illinois, and laid down runs of 180, 182, and then a truly jaw-dropping 189 miles an hour that destroyed the previous track record held by Chris Karamessinas at 186 miles an hour. The machine's look and powertrain had labeled it as the dragster of the future in magazines and a slew of newspaper reporting that followed its exploits through the Midwest and all the way to the East Coast. Now, the car ran in New Jersey and other coastal states as well. All of this was leading them back to the Nationals, where they made runs successfully on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Oh, and a side note about that 189-mile-an-hour speed they ran in Illinois. The car had been having issues shutting off down track and slowing through the traps, so the run, when it went 189 miles an hour, it started from 200 feet past the starting line. Now, I bet you could wish you could see this car and hear it, right? Well, now you can.
Another exhibition car, the Speed Sport 4 from Arizona, takes off like a rocket in a cloud of hot rubber smoke. Powered by 3 turbine engines, he blasts down the strip.
As they headed back west for the summer, they were booked into the typical California haunts and whooshed down all of them, trying in vain to reach 200 miles an hour. In an October Drag News interview, Lyle Fisher and Redgreth talked about their remaining dates in the fall in Texas and Arizona, but more interestingly, they talked about a new car, one that would be lighter, less complex, and far faster. One that would be certainly competitive with the top fuel cars of the era and would likely run 200 miles an hour with ease. It was a car they'd never build, but someone else would. Enter Dale Grantham. Now, part of the impetus for this video is the fact that Dale Grantham's air turbine-powered dragster, which looks terrifying, can often be found in photos on social media with no context. Well, here it comes. Like the Speed Sport guys, Dale Grantham was an exceptional young drag racer from Arizona. He began in the 50s, in his early 20s, and raced all manner of dragsters, stalkers, and more. He went into the Air Force, and when he got out in his later 20s, he went back to drag racing and went to college to get his degree as an English major. That's a curveball. By the early 1960s, Grantham was making the papers. Firstly, in 1961, as a hero who talked a shotgun-wielding man out of an altercation with law enforcement, but more specifically in drag racing by 1962, Grantham was a touring pro. You can find him racing as a featured act as far away from his home Arizona as New Jersey and New York. And somehow, by the end of 1962, Dale Grantham had gotten to know Don Hedinger, Cal Sorensen, and John Brown of AiResearch. Remember that new car Fisher and Greth were talking about at the end of the year? Whether they gave it up, whether they were snaked out of it, or whether AiResearch just wanted to go in a different direction, Dale Grantham was now the guy with the car and their support. It could simply be that Greth knew the act was one that wouldn't play long-term because of the machine's lack of noise and fury, or it could be that his team just wanted to go back to being racers and not exhibition performers. But it's interesting that a man who they had battled with for years on the strip would be their replacement with the Air car. As you will soon come to learn, they're likely thankful they got out when they did. When Dale Grantham rolled the new version of the AiResearch Dragster out to the public in the spring of 1963, it was a significant departure from the Speed Sport 4. The car was a shrunken version of the day's typical slingshot dragster. The entire machine weighed less than 600 pounds before Grantham got in it. The chassis was skeletal and only 33 inches tall, just enough to be taller than the slicks in the event of a rollover. 2 welding-style bottles were strapped to the side, 3 turbines went to 2, and gone was the large and heavy chain drive system, replaced with a far lighter planetary system of gears. The whole package was slickened up, shrunken down, and more efficient. The most stunning part of it all was the driver position. Laid out as if he were some sort of a devilish coffin, Grantham drove the car as if he was laying in a bed. It so appears that he's basically bolted into the car, and he may as well have been. It's a reasonably terrifying thing to look at. The turbines were hot-rodded to spin harder. The combustor made more robust, and the results showed quickly. The car was a half-second faster than its previous version, running in the bottom 8s and testing in early appearances, nearly 200 miles an hour and 7-second time slips within the grasp of this effort by the end of 1963. The starters, which were spinning at 70 to 80,000 RPM in the last version with 3, were now being worked to an advertised 95,000 RPM with only 2. Repeated low 8-second runs through this early part of the summer led to a July where the car was featured in drag news as being the space-age dragster and heralded for all of its advancements. And then, July 21st, 1963 happened. One of the turbines on the car exploded, shooting parts into the stands at Fontana Raceway and sending a young girl to the hospital with injuries. The car was midway down the drag strip when the failure occurred and shot shrapnel everywhere. The young girl was treated at the hospital for her wounds and was okay, according to the news reports of the day. The car was immediately banned from Fontana and many Southern California drag strips. With the involvement of AiResearch, we're guessing part of the reason it was never run again was because they pulled their parts and funding, and that seems a logical conclusion after a trauma like this. 3 months later, Dale Grantham crashed a dragster at Beeline Dragway in Arizona. He was treated for his injuries, including a broken shoulder. 3 months after that, his shop was broken into and thousands of dollars of tools, a tremendous amount for the day, were stolen. There's no record of Dale Grantham drag racing again after 1963, and that was a year that started with such promise and ended with such disaster. The good news is that in September of 1964, the Speed Sport 4 showed up to the reopening of Arizona Dragway to please the fans. Except it was a nitro-powered piston car that had nothing to do with the air turbine version. Oh well. The Speed Sport name continued to thrive in the sport of drag racing for years. Red Greth, an absolute legend, was part of the nostalgia scene for decades and earned his spot as one of the all-time greats. As for Dale Grantham, I can find no other drag racing information post what he had in his wreck at late 63, but there is a man with the same name from Arizona that became a top-level trap and skeet shooter for decades, winning contests and championship for years. Well, I can't prove it. I'm all but sure it's him. In the end, I don't think there have been two dragsters with an approach so radical in their own era to run as well as the top ranks in the history of the sport as these two did. This was a bizarre concept that was taken to its logical end. Aircraft starting turbines were not meant to be auto racing components, but when they worked, they were damn close. This was, by far, the most successful, out-of-the-box approach to all-out dragster racing in the 60s that did not have an internal combustion engine. Ultimately, it ended in failure, but for the fact that they had a vision, tried it, and it actually worked, legend. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more drag racing, historic, and gearhead content.